and welcome to Macros with Mythili, the ET Now show that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues in India and overseas. This week we're going to take a hard look at an issue that we've discussed often enough in the past. In fact, we've discussed the twists and turns in the GST's close to decade-long journey many times in the past. But as the date for implementation of GST nears, this week we're debating the timing of its implementation. Having waited so long, should we take the plunge right away? Or precisely because we waited so long, can we afford to wait just a little bit longer and defer the rollout by a few months so that when it does happen, there are fewer glitches? So should we defer the rollout to say 1st of September instead of the proposed 1st of July? As with all path-breaking course corrections in a country as complex as India, there are perhaps as many arguments to defer the rollout as to ram it through. We've got powerful voices, including the former Finance Minister P. Chidambaram, urging deferment. So let's hear what our experts, V.S. Krishnan, former member in charge GST at the Central Board of Indirect Taxes and presently with EY India, and Sridhar, Vice President Taxation, Hindustan Coca Cola Beverages, have to say on the issue. Welcome to the show, Sridhar, Krishnan.
Thank you. Thank you.
When somebody like a Chidambaram urges a rethink, one must necessarily pause and consider. The present deadline of 1st July is both impractical and undesirable, says a former FM, and points to the multiplicity of rates, the difficult compliance provisions, the lack of clarity in some provisions, and fitment or deciding which items fit into which slab, to just mention a few of the more important reasons. So let's start by examining each of these one by one. Take the issue of multiplicity of rates. Regardless of the advantages of a few rates, the fact is that multiplicity of rates 0, 5, 12, 18, 28 for goods with luxury cess that is not to exceed 15% of the peak GST rate, etc., is now a given. So how will giving more time help? Does industry need more time to prepare when there are multiple rates as compared to fewer rates, Krishnan?
Mythili, I think the most important point is the rates need to be finalized. The fitment committee, the technical experts are already deliberating the rate structure from the 1st of April. The expectation is that the rates will be finalized by the time of the next GST Council meeting. If the rates are decided by that time and then the 4 remaining rules get ratified, then maybe 1st July is a plausible date. But if the rates are not decided, then a postponement would become inevitable. So I personally feel that the GST Council may not be able to take a final view on the rates by that time, because there are a lot of issues like the rates on jewellery, and then the question of a merit rate on services, and also on the question of whether how many of those items now presently in the 28% rate will get down to 18. And here the problem is that there's a big revenue hit that the government will take. Can the government mop up revenue from somewhere else in order to be able to do this? So there are a whole host of issues, but I think it really hinges on rates being finalized. If the rates are finalized by the middle of May, then 1st July is plausible, but I think that's a little unlikely. It may get shifted to 1st of August or 1st of September. So it's the rate issue that really determines.
So it's the exact rates you say, and not the multiplicity of rights per se.
That's right.
Sridhar, would you agree? As someone who has a very difficult job of ensuring preparedness, will giving industry more time make it any easier to comply with a multi-rate GST? Or is it that since we still don't know what is the rate applicable for which commodity, and that will hopefully be decided in the meeting in May, leaving industry with just about a month perhaps to prepare for the July 1st rollout? So is there a case for more time, just given the sheer multiplicity of rates, Sridhar?
From an industry perspective, I must say we are getting prepared. There is no need for time for us. But from the larger issue of interacting with the downstream stakeholders, if you give me the rate on 1st of June, I change the whole composition, I provide due compliance wherever. I'm not talking of my industry or somebody's industry. I'm talking about general industry, compliance to the anti-profiteering mechanisms. Then I would say that the industry had to sit down, decide their maximum retail prices, look at the possible POSON, anti-profiteering compliance, and educate the downstream stakeholders. Now, maybe the question would be appropriate if you get the complete set of facts on 1st of June, within, let's say, 30 days, would it be possible for length and breadth of India mainly the trader community, from where the private sector has a lot of role in perhaps education and handholding. Would 30 days be enough is a large question. There is also one more play which I don't think so we have just now discussed. The GST and the IGST bill does not cover Jammu and Kashmir. What about all those industries which have got one unit of theirs in Jammu and Kashmir, in view of all the era of benefits period, where one unit still continues to exist in J&K? What about that integration of the units in Jammu and Kashmir with the rest of India? What about that? And how will the J&K as a state handle it? I would like to bring in the third dimension. All the SGST bills have commenced in their state assemblies. For example, Telangana has already done it. Now, if Telangana were to do it, what about the balance states? What is the time period for the rollout before, let's say, 5th of June or 1st of June? If everybody were to do it before trot on 1st of June, then we have a great starter. But looking at education and downstream outreach programs, I feel even 60 days for the length and breadth of India may not be sufficiently enough, because we have a moral responsibility and a fiduciary responsibility for outreach, and likewise every industry would have it.
Sridhar, you spoke of industry being fully prepared, but is that true only of large industry, or would you say it's equally true of medium-sized industries? I know there is an exemption limit of 1.5 crores, but there would be many small units perhaps and medium-sized units who perhaps are not yet ready. Sridhar?
As far as the GST composition limit goes, it is 20 to 50 lakhs. So there's no question of any more 1.5 crores. So above 50 lakhs, you are the complete part of the GST chain. And to answer that question, I would still feel there would be at more difficulty, because their resources for integrating their work would depend on the advisory capacity that they have and how they are being handheld by the statutory bodies also at the same time. The Government of India has started a very great initiative of outreach. You must really commend the Government of India for doing this. But the question is not whether they are reaching or not. The question is how much of this country you can cover in 60 days. I would like to stick to that point. Looking at the span of India, are we capable of doing this before 30th of June?
Absolutely. Krishnan, but the former FM also points to a very important clause that has been criticized by many people earlier also. This is that section 171 that deals with alleged profiteering. On paper, one can't quarrel with the underlying rationale, but it's a bit like communism, wonderful in theory but impossible in practice. So my question to you, Krishnan, really is, will this not open up huge scope for discretion in interpretation and give extraordinary powers to tax officials? Powers that we've seen very often in the past, we've seen they're often abused even when they're used. So should we not rethink this before we plunge into a system that is so flawed? How do you define profiteering? And if there were no profits to make, why would anybody be in business at all, Krishnan?
I think partly the anti-profiteering clause is really saying this, that if there have been some gains that you have had because of the GST in terms of lowering incidence and all that, should you not pass it on to the customer? And this has been an eternal problem. I remember in the excise days, whenever you gave excise duty concessions, the government always said the industry should pass on it, and it always never did happen. So, but here the Secretary of Revenue has been very clear, and I think in his interviews, that considerable safeguards will be kept to ensure that the anti-profiteering clause will not be invoked except in exceptional circumstances. This is coming from the Secretary of Revenue himself. So I don't think that the anti-profiteering clause would be invoked very easily. But I would tend to agree with the general view that we could have done without it. I think there would have been no need for having a anti-profiteering clause, and I think the Malaysian parallel, there's a different background, because all taxes were not subsumed in the Malaysian experiment, GST experiment. But I think we could have done it without this.
Absolutely. Sridhar, how apprehensive is industry about this clause? And should it use the intervening time to lobby more effectively for a rethink? And is that another reason why we need more time? Because frankly, it's going to be very difficult to say how much of the profit is because of lower GST, how much because of some other factors. And taxmen should always be viewed with suspicion. Apologies to you, Krishnan, but to my mind, taxmen should always be viewed with suspicion. What do you think, Sridhar?
Now, from an industry perspective, the industry is always willing to cooperate with the government on anything that reaches the consumer, because anything that reaches the consumer will come back in terms of increased demand. That is one aspect of it, which is the social aspect. Now, coming to the most important aspect, whenever we talk about these kind of over-archival provisions, what about the missionary provisions to make them effective on 1st of July? And since Mr. Krishnan sir is sitting in the panel, we don't have missionary provisions as of today, as we are talking to each other, to make that effective. So first you'll have to publish the missionary provisions, the way it would be made effective, and which will be the body that would do the implementation, and what are the processes involved in the implementation. I think these three important aspects are there, and between 1st of May to 30th of June is too little a time to discuss this. Maybe it would have to wait for some time until all these three important factors are put in place.
Okay, well, I think you're more charitable, because I'm less worried about the machinery and more about the sheer principle of being against profiteering and looking at profits as if it's a bad word. But Krishnan, Chidambaram has also questioned the logic of keeping key inputs such as real estate, alcohol, electricity, and for the moment petroleum outside GST, calling it a very unsatisfactory compromise, as these items account for as much as 40% of the GDP. How imperfect does that make the GST, and is there a case for trying a little harder to get these items also included? And could that be another reason for asking for more time, or is this all now a given? And whether the rollout is on 1st of July or any later date makes no difference as far as getting a complete chain is concerned. Krishnan?
I think, Mythili, the point is that, I mean, nobody can disagree with the fact that it would have been far better to have more items within the GST.
Sure.
But Mr. Chidambaram's own bill, the 115th amendment, did not have real estate in it.
It's always easier to criticize an opposition, that is true.
The point here is, the point is well taken, and it's been made clear by the finance minister that they will look at it in the second round, that real estate and buildings will be considered for inclusion. And in the case of petroleum, it's far easier now. The GST, the law says that the GST council at any time can say petroleum should be included. It's being zero rated now, and the existing levies are going to continue. But at any time, the council can decide, and if revenues are buoyant, Mythili, the whole thing is, it all hinges on how revenues do. Once revenues boom, then I think the states and the center would be more forthcoming in doing many of the things that need to be done.
That is true, except that offsets become much more difficult to really, implement in practice if such a large number of items are omitted. But I'm afraid it's time for us to slip into a very short break. But please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing whether there is a case at all to defer the GST rollout from the 1st of July proposed by the government to a little later, maybe 1st of September or 1st October. And I'm in discussion with Sridhar and Mr. V.S. Krishnan. Sridhar, before the break, Krishnan was saying that, well, this is something that is a given. We've tried very hard and we've got to live with this right now. And maybe experience will show how we should try and change this. But how much this kind of exclusion complicate compliance for industry? And if you cannot claim input tax credit on some key inputs, will this not break the entire chain of set-offs? So should we work a little harder on trying to somehow get agreement? In the case of real estate, for instance, if taxes paid on steel, cement, paint, etc. cannot be credited against the GST to be paid in the output, will it not make matters much more difficult for industry?
From an integration perspective, I should say unintegrated credits always add to the cost of production. That's a given fact in an economic cost concept and as well as a value concept. Now, getting to the basic question that the law has been rolled out, it may not be possible in round one for all these sectors to come in, and in round two, as Mr. Krishnan correctly put it, and considering the push by the petroleum industry at large, we can expect petroleum to be inside GST because the GST Council will decide on it very quickly. So that is as far as the excluded sector mainly of petroleum is concerned. And as regards the other sectors, mainly the real estate sector, which has been widely talked about, that also has got a larger ramification. Would the larger aspect of stamp duties, which is a revenue earning cow for the state governments, be brought into the GST fold and brought inside the GST? is a very big question, not a tax question. It's an economic question, it is a political question, and I think these are questions that is best left to the parliament and the states and their assemblies to answer them.
But can we go through some kind of a piecemeal GST like this, Mr. Sridhar? You don't think industry is going to find it very difficult in practice to claim credit for the tax that they've paid on inputs when it's not part of the GST
Can I
change?
just point out to you that I was not receiving credit of high-speed diesel. I was not receiving credit of that which was used for my generator even today.
Okay.
So under the Senvat regime, and I was not getting credit of it. Most of the states don't allow credit. All the states don't allow the credit for all the petroleum products.
Okay, so you already have lived with quite a few imperfections.
We have that unintegrated portion. I would rather appreciate many unintegrated levies. I would say must commend the government of India on behalf of the food industry. I would like to commend for this exemplary step. For example, in the amendments recently carried out, the unintegrated levies, the sugar cess has been merged and it is subsumed with the GST. As a matter of fact, that goes to a great level of the depth at which the government of India has looked at these unintegrated duties, and wherever possible they have provided relief, and thanks to the government on that.
That is true. They have tried and it's a mammoth task. But Krishnan, the council is going to look at fitment only in the latter part of May, after which the fitments will have to be made public, and assuming that there is no major hoo-ha about it. And that's a major if, because we'll get consensus only by say mid-June. To give an example that I think Veerappa Moily mentioned in Parliament, is coconut oil an edible product, as Malayalis will swear, and to be taxed accordingly, or is it a cosmetic as the rest of the country will equally strongly vouch for, and should it be taxed as a cosmetic? I am assuming that the fitment need not be cleared in Parliament, as these will be part of the GST rules. But even so, should this part, the very last mile as it were, be so rushed, and can industry and the public get ready for it when you finally decide only by about middle of June, come to an agreement, and you only have about 15 days, Krishnan?
Mythili, I don't think it's a big deal whether the GST comes on the 1st of July or the 1st of September. In fact, the government itself has been saying that we have an open mind on this. So if that extra 2 months can give some relief, I think the government would have no objection. And as far as the rates are concerned, the GST Council has laid down a broad principle for fitment, saying that generally the commodities would be fitted near the rate slots they are now subject to. So that's the broad guideline. But I still feel that that it would be prudent on the part of the government to really bring down the 28 items to 18, because that will be a big relief. And GST's benefits for Make in India and organized industry will really depend on the incidence of duty coming down, because that's what GST claimed, that at least on the goods side, the incidence of duty would come down. Having said this, there is a very interesting thing which I think viewers should note on the GST, and this was brought out in the interesting piece that the CA wrote on the 4th. And the point is this: in the pre-GST period, the visible output taxes that you see are not really the tax burden that the consumer really bears. Yes. To give an example, tractors are exempt. But if you were to look at the embedded taxes, they are really subject to 12%.
Right.
So 0 on tractors before GST is equivalent to 12% on tractors after GST. So now this communication of this message,
illusion, yes.
And this has to be conveyed, because otherwise the general impression will be, no, it's gone up from 0 to 12. I think that's the important point, that a lot of communication needs to be done about these aspects, and that's important. But having said that, I think the rates must also come down on the output side for, I think, the GST to really have an impact.
Sridhar, Krishnan just talked about how the public itself is going to see a higher rate on paper. So do you see a flurry of representations both from public as well as from industry wanting classifications at a lower rate or wanting to be explained once the fitment is done? And if that is going to be so, isn't it better to give everybody a little bit more time rather than have endless lawsuits, PILs, etc. in the courts later?
I personally feel the window of representation was open. Various forums have gone and appeared before the Honorable GST Council, as well as the Government of India and the states wherever required. The inputs have been collected, and the current deliberations which are there before the rate subcommittees and committees of the GST Council are post those interactions. And I think the sooner the rates are published, the better it is for the implementation.
Except that the rates will get decided only late May. So how much time is that? Does that really leave you, Sridhar?
Yeah, it would give us only the 30 days time. I would still say that it would give us only 30 days time. But what I mentioned in my first point is much more important. It's not the rate being given to me, it is the time that is left with the industry or with the trade. Even a distributor has to communicate to his retailer what he wants to do. And I will have to help the distributor to communicate to the retailer. I need to outreach. So is the time enough for the outreach is the right question.
Absolutely. Is the time enough for the outreach? And Krishnan, you often argued the case for a GST secretariat, both at the union and at the state level. Has there been any move really to create such a secretariat and staff it? And if not, won't it be a good idea to get it in place before we implement GST? And isn't that another reason maybe to wait till 1st of September? Krishnan?
I think, Mythili, I've been writing about this often, that the GST Council is a body for discussing policy matters like rates and exemptions. Today, there's going to be an institutional void at the state level, because there's no body that the trade can go to at the state level to deal with non-policy implementation issues, which is why I have suggested that the GST Council should in fact pass a resolution calling for a creation of a GST secretariat in the states, which could be followed up by the cabinet secretary writing to the chief secretaries to create this body. But this can take its course, Mythili. It can go on parallelly. It can be set up in another 5-6 months. So by the time it's implemented and issues can come up, the GST secretariat can be a very useful forum for trade and industry to represent before this body, and also create bonds of trust between central and state government officials who could be brought into an institutional platform like the GST secretariat.
Sridhar, assuming that the government is very determined to go through with that 1st of July deadline, what kind of a priority list would you set before the government? 1, 2, 3. What should they do in that limited time that they have between the GST Council meeting in the middle of May and 1st of July? What are the 3 or 4 most critical items that you would like government to address?
One is the governmental platform outreach for the trade and for the lower level of the trade, the retail trade. That is something that I would like the government to also support the industry to outreach. That is the first priority. The second priority, kindly make all the rules and the relevant machinery provisions final by 1st of June, including the anti-profiteering if possible, or if that is not possible, postpone that implementation of that provision wherever is required. And the third most important point, which I feel is the backbone, the GSTN is the backbone of this tax. So for the first 6 months to 9 months, it must be a motivational approach to encouraging compliance and making less mistakes in the principles of matching, principles of supporting to ensure that the returns are correctly uploaded, rather than kind of finding fault in the compliance, mainly for the small traders who have come in to the GSTN chain because they are above 50 lakhs. These 3 points are very important.
Absolutely. Krishnan, we would like to add to that, and I think Sridhar mentioned the GSTN, and given the fact that I think there have been estimates that they're going to have to handle roughly about 30 billion invoices a day in a scenario where many companies in fact do not even generate invoices, what would you like to list before the government as the 3 or 4 most important things to do before the 1st of July, assuming that they're determined to go through for 1st of July? I know you also, I mean, I must agree with you on that. I think there's a case for being just a little bit more patient, but assuming that the government does not wish to show that patience, what do you think should be the topmost priority for the government before the 1st of July?
I think, Mythili, the most important challenge is the technological challenge, because everybody now is going to go onto a common portal of the GSTN. That really holds the key. Out of 75 lakh people who are likely to be registered on the GSTN, 65 lakhs will be small and medium, who will use what's called an offline utility developed by the GSTN, much like the way in which we file our income tax returns. So they would need the help of, the equivalent of the tax return preparers who will hold hands and tell them how to use this facility. So as they get more and more familiar with this, I think that will ease the task. And I completely agree with Sridhar that in the initial period, the approach should be motivational, hand-holding, and mistakes should be viewed liberally. I think that's the key, and I think that's what the GSTN's approach is going to be. It's very clear from the presentations made by them that they are going to take a liberal view at least in the initial periods, to facilitate investment, I mean the rollout. So I think the GST and challenge to me is the biggest challenge.
And I do hope you're right in that they will extend a helping hand, but I'm afraid that's all the time we have in this episode, so we'll have to end this discussion now. Clearly there's a lot of ground that's yet to be covered. In fact, Montek Singh Ahluwalia called it a case of being so good so far, but not good enough. Possibly, but it's also the case that in real life nothing is ever as good as it can be, so it might be foolish to just let the best be the enemy of the good. Apart from which, the fact is that when it comes to muddling along, we're pretty good as a nation at muddling along. So I'm afraid we'll have to wait and see what the government finally decides, or rather what the GST Council decides. Thank you so much, Sridhar and Krishnan, for explaining the pros and cons of deferring GST to our viewers. Thank you also for watching. Remember, we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. In the meantime, if there's any issue that you'd like to see discussed in this program, do write into us at the email ID you see at the bottom of your screen.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/ETNow.